is a lot about graphs. It's all about graphs and functions and starting to understand what's going on with graphs. So I pre-filled in all this stuff for you. I was going to make you write it in, but we're short on time today. So if you see a closed dot in a graph, if it's closed in, that means that that solution is part of the graph. If you see an open dot, it's not part of the graph. But the big things with these two is this means that the graph stops. Because part of what you're going to have to tell me today is some intervals of when things are happening on the graph. And this means that it's going to stop somewhere. So it's going to have a definite stop and start point if you see dots. If you see arrows in a graph means that it keeps going on forever and ever and ever, either to negative infinity or positive infinity. So that's going to have to be part of your range of values when we report those. And then the bottom should really just be a review of things we've already talked about this year. The x-intercept is where the graph hits the x-axis. The y-intercept is where the graph hits the y-axis. And then the domain is the set of all possible x values. The range is the set of all possible y values. With those last two, what I want to talk about is when you look at the graph, what you should be looking at. So the domain is x. The domain, we're looking this way on the graph. That's the way x goes, isn't it? Doesn't x go across on the graph? And then when we talk about range when we're looking at a graph is going to go this way. And I'm going to try and color code this as we go. So this is what the problems on the beginning of your homework are going to look like. They're going to give you a graph, and they're going to ask you for a ton of information. So part A is to find the function's domain, and this is what some people struggle with here. So when you're talking about the domain, the focus is on the x-axis. So you want to think about going in that direction, what the graph is doing. So you need to look at the ends of the graph. Do you see the ends of the graph right now? Aren't they both arrows? So does that mean it's going to keep going? So if I'm trying to figure out what the span is going in the x direction, isn't just going to keep stretching out forever and ever and ever? So the domain for this problem, because it's going to keep going in both directions, is negative infinity to positive infinity. It doesn't stop, it keeps going. So it can stretch, it can touch all x values. So domain, remember, is x. So our domain right now is from negative infinity to positive infinity. The range, I'm going to do this in red up here. The range is talking about y. Does the graph, when we look at it going vertically right now, does the graph touch everywhere?
No.
No. It starts up here at 4, right? And it keeps going on forever and ever and ever and ever in that direction because there are arrows. So if you kind of mark that on the graph, this is the easiest way I've come up with to explain it. If you mark what's going on the graph up there, I can zoom in a little bit so you guys can see more. I marked in red what's going on in the graph. That's going to keep going from the 4 down, but when we describe this, we need to describe the lowest number up to the highest number. So when we do the range, the lowest number it's going to hit is negative infinity up to positive 4. So that's our range. And we're going to do a couple of these because I know these are a little harder to understand. And it's going to include 4 because it does hit at 4. So we're going to put a bracket with 4.
How do you know that it's a bracket?
Because it hits 4. You're going to see in a second it's going to be mostly brackets unless you see an open circle. If you see an open circle, then you're going to have to put parentheses. And we're going to see those on the next page. Questions on A or B? C and D, I'm hoping, are really easy. C asks for what are the x-intercepts? Negative 3 and positive 1. And then D asks for the y-intercept. Positive 3. I don't think it likes to explain everything up there. And then the last thing is if there's any functions underneath the graph, evaluating it. For this one, we don't have this. So this one we can skip because there is no function. You'll see on the next page what I'm talking about. All right, let's try another example of finding domain and range of a function because I know it's a little harder concept to grasp onto. So for the domain, again, you're looking for how much it stretches horizontally. You're trying to figure out how much it moves from left to right, how much of the graph it covers. So if we focus in on here, this graph, the farthest left it can get to is -6, and what we need to pay attention to is there's an open circle at -6, so that actually means this is going to be a parenthesis here. And then it covers all the way until we get to that closed point, so that's actually all the way to 0, and that's going to be a bracket. So my domain, the horizontal cover, is from -6 to 0. Again, we have a parenthesis at -6 because there was an open circle at that value, but it's a bracket at 0 because that's a closed circle. And then the range is the y value, so it's how much it stretches vertically. So we're going to look, if you want to start at the top, you can. It reaches up to 4, and that's going to be parenthesis because it's an open circle. And then it stretches down here to -3, which is a closed circle, so it's a bracket. Just make sure when you write your interval that you're starting at the bottom and going to the top when you do the range, because we want to make sure we're starting with the lowest value. So it's bracket -3 up to +4 parenthesis. Alright, part C and part D I'm hoping you're pretty good with here. Part C is the x-intercept, which is about right here. And that appears to be about -3.75. I think the ones in the homework are a little bit more accurate. And then the y-intercept is down here at -3. And then this last part, it's a part I was trying to explain on the last page, but there was an example of that yet. So what you're going to see for some of these for part E is that you're going to see a value there. What that's asking you to do, when you look at that, it says we need to find f of -5. So remember, this is your input value. So they're saying you need to look at the graph where x, that's your x value, where x equals -5. And you need to find what y is. So I'm literally going to look on the graph at where x is -5, which is here, and I'm going to go up to the graph and find what the y value is at that point, and that's 2. So the answer, to answer that question, is f of -5 equals 2. I think the only answer you'll see in the book is 2, but I just wrote it out so we're used to that notation, what that means. That means if we input -5 for x, the output value for the function is going to be 2. Alright, let's look at another one. I'm going to start talking about this. I know I didn't give you a whole lot of time to think, but if you look at the domain, we're trying to figure out, again, that's where the graph is stretching out horizontally. If I look this way, isn't it going to keep going left? And as it grows this way, isn't it going to keep moving right along the x-axis? So if I just focus on the x-axis, it's going to cover all parts of the x-axis, isn't it? Because of the arrows means it keeps going forever. So this is -infinity to +infinity. That's going to happen sometimes with your domain. It's going to be both.
Yeah, I thought because it stopped, it went up.
But it's going to keep stretching. You have to think of where it's going to stretch horizontally. Isn't it going to keep expanding out horizontally?
Yeah.
As it goes up, because it's an arrow, it's not stopped. As it goes up, it's going to keep stretching horizontally. You're just focused on the horizontal movement of it for the domain. Then you have to look at the vertical movement of it for the range. So if I'm looking vertically, it doesn't get any of these values down here, right? Vertically, it starts here,
Okay.
and it's going to go,
So it's 0 infinity.
I meant for this to be red. It's going to be from here, and it's going to keep going up, isn't it? So the range is from 0, including 0, so I guess that should be a bracket. From 0 on to infinity. Here's the weird thing, and this is super weird. The x-intercept is all of this section, isn't it? Isn't this all x-intercept here? So the way we're going to write that is kind of what I showed you guys yesterday. It's going to be all x values such that x is less than or equal to 0. That whole line where it's less than or equal to 0 are going to be x-intercepts. I don't think you're going to see a lot like that on your homework, so. But just to show you a little bit of mathy stuff. What about the y-intercept? There will always only be one y-intercept, so it's just 0. And then do we understand this last part here? F of negative 2? F of negative 2 is 0. Because again, you're looking on the graph where x is negative 2. And you're telling me the y value, so that's 0. You're finding that point. And what about f of positive 2? Should be up there at 4, yeah. Questions? Can we just look at the last page together? Alright, so you guys should remember this from Algebra 2, but the vertical line test is what you can use to decide if a graph is a function. So if you can take a vertical line and as you pass from left to right over the graph it only intersects at one point, then it is a function. If it intersects at more than one point, it is not a function. So if you watch here, I'm going to move this vertical line 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, all the way through its 1 point. So this is a function. Because it passes the vertical line test. You can get all the way to the end with only intersecting 1 point. If you look at number 2, as I pass this line through, it intersects at 2 points. So this does not pass. This is not a function because it doesn't pass the vertical line test. And then the last one, if I take this vertical line and move it over 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, I can get all the way through with just hitting 1 point, so this one is a function. So it's all about whether or not you can pass over it with only hitting 1 point. If you hit 2, like in number 2, then it's not a function.